So once again, I want to remind us of our the affirmations, the central affirmations that we're looking at throughout this study. God creates creation and has a specific purpose for it. The relationship between God and creation develops through speaking and listening. God's word to creation is a sovereign call, but it is a kind of call which invites obedience rather than demands allegiance. God loves creation, but creation refuses to let God be God. And the relationship between God and creation is marked by tension between God's purposes and creation's resistance to God's purposes. So, common interpretations of this particular narrative. We're looking at Genesis chapter 6, verse 5 through chapter 9, verse 17. Traditionally has been looked at in two different ways. One is historical, as a historical narrative. This is what happened and how it happened in history. That's been a traditional approach for a lot of times, that it is seen as a historical account. The opposing point of view is a literary point of view that concerns itself not so much as it as a historical account, but more as a mythological story, or a myth that resides along with the other myths. What the book, and the book draws heavily from the interpretation book, which features Walter Brueggemann's writings. And what Brueggemann says is that neither one are what he's using for interpretation. He's not looking that that both of them are a false way of looking at it. That it's not, we weren't there, so we don't have any first-hand accounts in order to make it a historical account. In order for something to be history, recorded as history, we have to have some sort of first-person witness. And we don't have that. We don't have anybody. We don't have a writings of Noah or his family. So we don't know exactly, in a historical sense, how the flood happened. That's verified by traditional historical accounting. There has been, for a number of years, I can remember as a kid, there was a movie that came out, In Search of Noah's Ark. Remember that movie? And they were trying to find the archaeological evidence for the ark, and they were centering their search on Mount Ararat, because that's where it's believed that the ark landed. And it was pretty inconclusive. The movie was pretty inconclusive. And what Brueggemann argues is that even if we did find it, it would be helpful, but that's not the purpose of the account. That's not the purpose of the flood story. It's not to give a historical account. That the Israelites the people who were writing it had another purpose for writing it, which I would actually argue with Brueggemann and say that's generally the case with all history. That history is always written from any history that you would write is written from a perspective and a certain agenda. That if, take for the Civil War, for example, you can have facts that are written, but how they are written and how they are shaped would probably differ from somebody who's writing from a state that was on the Union side versus someone who is writing from a state that was on the Confederate side. That the history written by the, quote, winners and the history written by the, quote, losers are going to tell about the same event, but they're going to tell about it from a different perspective, right? So, I don't know how we can avoid completely the accounting of the flood from a historical perspective. But what we want to center on is what themes govern it. Nor can we write it off simply as a myth that belongs with other myths. Because that framework, that understanding of the flood, that perspective, what it says about God and what it says about us is foundational to our belief in God and our belief in how God operates. So it's not just a myth to us. It's a truth. And it's a myth in a larger sense that all stories about how we begin are myths, but it's not a myth in the terms that we have come to understand it, which means a fanciful story. It's not a fanciful story. It's a story that grounds us in our belief. And that in our belief is true to God and true to us, and says something significant and true about our relationship. The sources, when you do source analysis of this particular passage, pretty much similar to the previous passage, is that it's a mixture of the Yahwist and the priestly sources. But what Brueggemann points out to that is that that analysis also is not that necessary, in that they're blended together in such a way that together they work to say the same thing. That we don't see a lot of competing narratives going on. They're blended into a narrative much more seamlessly than, say, the creation story. Those are just some opening considerations. Take them for what they're worth. So let's start looking into the looking at the narrative. And there's three parts. What Brueggemann in the resource book identifies as the story being in three parts. The beginning, which is Genesis 6:5 through 7:16. The ending, which is 8:20 through 9:17, and then the turning point, which is 7:17 through 8:19. You notice that they're not in order, because we essentially what the resource book wants to do is to see set up first the comparison of what's going on in the beginning, what happens, what's going on before the flood, and then what happens after the flood. Because there's a tremendous change, and it isn't the change isn't so much what is wrought by the flood itself, but what is changed in the relationship between God and human beings. Because that's the real story. The flood is just a stage. The real drama is what's going on between God and creation. And it goes back to those affirmations, the tension that is between God and creation, creator and creation, the unwillingness of the creation to let God be God, and how that relationship has changed. And what Brueggemann argues, that comes out through this, is that what is remarkable about this narrative is not that the world was flooded. What is remarkable is that there's a change that is happening, and the change isn't happening in humankind, but is happening in God. That's what's coming out in the story. That's the significant message, is that there's a change in God. Now, that's hard for us to accept, because we grow up with this, at least I grew up with this sense that God is immutable, unchangeable. God was, is, and forevermore the same. And in a certain way, that's true. But what the Hebrew Scriptures bring to us is that within that character of God, that is, has integrity and doesn't change, that there are changes in that character that tell us more about God, that in a way for us, for lack of a better word, humanizes God for us. Where God becomes a more real presence for us, a more understandable presence. So what we see in this narrative is not so much a vengeful, punishing God, but rather a God that is in grief and in pain over the betrayal of God's own children, of God's own creation. That God has, as in the affirmations that we went through, God has a purpose, a vision of what the world's going to be. But God doesn't make that vision a fiat or an imposition, but rather intends for the creation to get there on its own, out of freedom, out of choice. And when creation rejects that, it pains God. It hurts the heart of God. To me, that's a tremendous liberating point of view. It's liberating because it allows me to feel a closer relationship to God. I feel less close to a God that doesn't feel anything than I do to a God who can be pained by my rejection of it. I can understand that better because I can see it from the point of view of a son who brought disappointment to my father at times, and the pain that it caused him. So, in that sense, then I can understand, and I can see, and I can value how my sin can bring pain to God, who sees something different for me than what I do. So, let's go ahead and start looking at the passage. So we start with chapter 6, verse 5. The Lord saw that the wickedness of humankind was great in the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of their hearts was only evil continually. And the Lord was sorry that he had made humankind on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. See, there you have that language. So the Lord said, I will blot out from the earth the human beings I have created, people together with animals and creeping things and birds of the air, for I am sorry that I have made them. But Noah found favor in the sight of the Lord. These are the descendants of Noah. Noah was a righteous man and blameless in his generation. Noah walked with God, and Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Notice those 2 verses. But Noah found favor in the sight of the Lord, and then these are the descendants of Noah. Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. Noah walked with God, and Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Right there we have a blending of the 2 sources, J and P. Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight, and the earth was filled with violence. And God saw that the earth was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted its ways upon the earth. Notice the language, had corrupted its ways. Wasn't corrupted by anything else, had corrupted itself. For all flesh had corrupted its ways upon the earth. And God said to Noah, I have determined to make an end of all flesh, for the earth is filled with violence because of them. Now I'm going to destroy them along with the earth. So, what did God see in humankind? That caused him to make that judgment of blotting out the earth. Saw violence, okay. Corruption. Depravity. Okay. Anything else? Evil heart. Okay, so what God sees in all this is something that can't be corrected, right? God doesn't see any solution. You know, if humankind was occasionally violent, occasionally evil, not so much in the heart, but, just follow temptations every once in a while, then, okay, maybe can deal with this. But God saw something else. God saw a totality of evil. God couldn't look at humankind anymore, couldn't look at the creation anymore. So it goes beyond disappointment. It feels more like betrayal. Where God feels almost wounded by how humankind hasn't just drifted away from God, or creation hasn't drifted away from God, but chose to turn away from God, chose to go their own devices. So this is what Brueggemann calls the pathos of God. That's what we're seeing in these opening verses is God's pathos. We're not seeing so much anger. We're not seeing so much vengeance. We're not seeing so much righteous indignation. What we're seeing is a pathos, or the pain, the passion of God, of a parent, of a father, who has come to the realization that his children are hopeless. Can you imagine ever having seen in your children as hopeless? Imagine what that pain would be. That no matter what, where you sit down and you say, okay, no matter what I do, they're never going to change. It's never going to get better. That's the pathos of God in this moment. That's what makes these opening verses, this beginning, so impactful. This is a change from the way I grew up thinking about this story. Because I always thought God was just fed up. That God was just in control and saying, okay, I'm going to show you, I'll just destroy the earth. But what we see, especially in that verse of God feeling grief, is a story where God is, yes, God is creator. God is in control of creation. God can bring the end to the natural world. There's no doubt about God's power. But what God can't do, because he has chosen not to, is to control the hearts and the minds of people. That's our choice. And because it's our choice, we have within us the capacity, as much as we don't want to believe it, of hurting God, of grieving God. Because we are choosing to not just not be obedient, but to be antagonistic to God. So, then we have the details of how Noah, who is the one person who is blameless, and notice how we don't get much information about Noah. I mean, earlier we know who his father was, but we're not given any picture really of Noah in any sort of specific way. We don't know if he was a natural carpenter, if that was his trade. We don't know what his vocation was. We know that he had 3 sons. We don't know how he met his wife. We don't know what we know nothing about Noah except for that he existed. He had 3 sons. He was a son of Lamech, and that he was a good man. That he was blameless. That God saw him as the one good person on earth. And God said to Noah, I have determined to make an end of all flesh, for the earth is filled with violence because of them, and now I'm going to destroy them along with the earth. Make yourself an ark of cypress wood. Make rooms in the ark, and cover it inside and out with pitch. This is how you are to make it. The length of the ark, 300 cubits, its width, 50 cubits, and its height 30 cubits. Make a roof for the ark and finish it to a cubit above. And put the door of the ark in its side. Make it with the lower, second, and third decks. For my part, I am going to bring a flood of waters on the earth to destroy them from under the heaven. All flesh in which is the breath of life, everything that is on the earth shall die. But I will establish my covenant with you. And you shall come into the ark, you and your sons, your wife, and your sons' wives with you. And of every living thing, of all flesh, you shall bring 2 of every kind into the ark to keep them alive with you. They shall be male and female. Of words, of the birds, I've gone past the beginning. So actually we stop at the making of the ark. So let's skip on to the ending. Well, wait. So, Sheila, go back to the beginning. So, what we see is, we see the indictment of creation. We see also how God is going to resolve this situation. So the indictment is that humankind is evil. The resolution of this reality, or how this reality is going to be resolved, is that everybody but Noah is going to die. The pathos is that it grieves God. God is grieved by this situation. He's not happy. God isn't righteously indignant. He is sorry he ever created earth. He's grieved in the heart. In the role of Noah, and we'll get into this later, but Noah is seen as the only hope for any future. Because Noah is the only good man, only good that God sees in God's creation, Noah becomes the hope for a new creation. As well as the male and female of all living things. So, there is a connection going on between what we see at the beginning of Genesis and this. Because at the beginning of creation, how does it start? In the beginning, God saw what? Well, before that, at the very beginning. In the beginning, right, from what? From nothing, except for that there was waters, right? Spirit over the face of the waters. So there's a sense of chaos going on in waters. So now, how is God going to recreate out of chaos and waters? Right? After the flood, God's going to again create a new world with dry land and living beings and humankind. So we have a parallel creation story. So, now I lost my thought. Any comments about what's going on so far? Any?
Somewhere it says, God says, not always will my spirit strike in the flesh.
That comes in the part now, the ending, right? So, moving on to the ending, 8:20. Then Noah built an altar to the Lord and took of every clean animal and of every clean bird and offered burnt offerings on the altar. And when the Lord smelled the pleasing odor, the Lord said in his heart, I will never again curse the ground because of humankind, for the inclination of the human heart is evil from youth. Nor will I ever again destroy every living creature as I have done. As long as the earth endures, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease. God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. The fear and dread of you shall rest on every animal of the earth, and on every bird of the air, and on everything that creeps on the ground, and on all the fish of the sea. Into your hand they are delivered. Every moving thing that lives shall be food for you, and just as I gave you the green plants, I give you everything. Only you shall not eat flesh with its life, that is, its blood. For your own lifeblood I will surely require a reckoning. From every animal I will require it, and from every human being, each one for the blood of another. I will require a reckoning for human life. Whoever sheds the blood of a human, by a human, shall that person's blood be shed. For in his image, his own image, God made humankind. And you, be fruitful and multiply, abound on the earth, and multiply in it. Then God said to Noah and to his sons with him, as for me, I am establishing my covenant with you and your descendants, and with every living creature that is with you, the birds, the domestic animals, and every animal on the earth, with you as they may come out of the ark. I will establish my covenant with you that never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of a flood, and never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. God said, this is the sign of the covenant that I make between me and you, and every living creature that is with you, for all future generations. I have set my bow in the clouds, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. When I bring clouds over the earth, and the bow is seen in the clouds, I will remember my covenant that is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh, and the waters shall never again become a flood to destroy all flesh. When the bow is in the clouds, I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is on the earth. God said to Noah, this is a sign of the covenant that I have established between me and all flesh that is on earth. Notice in that passage what is going on. There's repetition over and over again. The words are said in different ways. That itself is probably a sign or example of the blending of the two sources of J and P. The language that has that centers on covenant is more likely coming from the priestly source. The other language, the other accounts that speak less of covenant and more of using other languages, usually probably coming from the J source. Just wanted to point that out. So, God, what we see from here is we see God speaking from the heart. We see a restatement of God's intention for creation, and we see a statement of God's covenant with creation. So the heart speech, what we see, some questions that come out of that is, has creation changed? Is there anything different in creation? No, we see some of the same language that we see in the first creation. We see the same relationship that humankind has with the other living beings that we saw in the creation story. We see the same expectations, be fruitful and multiply. We see a little bit of difference in the whole shedding of the blood. You know, whoever sheds the blood of another human being, that person shall shed blood. And we see the presence of now burnt offerings. But generally, the creation hasn't changed. It's no different. Human beings are just as sinful. Human beings are just as weak. So that hasn't changed. Has creation changed? No. With whom does the hope of the future lie? Who? With God. You could say, and my traditional view is that the hope of creation lied in Noah, except for Noah is an imperfect human being. And we're going to find that out in the next passage, right? Which isn't in the book, by the way. So the hope for the future lies not in humankind, because humankind isn't going to change. The hope for the future lies in God, who has changed in this. Yeah. Well, that's where incarnational theology comes in. But so, just for the people watching online, the question was that Diane said is that somehow she has in her mind, in her memory, that from the foundations of the earth, or from the very beginning, Jesus was intended to die. Right, so that there's always going to be a tension between humankind and the serpent. That's the message of creation. what that suggests is that the tension is really between humankind and creation, which has been charged to take care of. That relationship is no longer easy. The simple relationship that existed in Eden no longer exists after Eden, or east of Eden, because now everything human beings tries to do on earth, they have to fight, and there's toil involved. And that's the result of the loss of innocence. And so there's a tension not only between creation and God, but between creation and humankind, who is in the image of God. So, back to the question about Jesus being intended to die from the beginning, is that because of this tension existing, there has to be, in some way, some sort of bridge between God and creation, or between God and humankind. Since that exists from the beginning, what also has to exist from the beginning is a resolution of that. And the only resolution of that is for God, because humankind can't get there by ourselves, we can't get there by itself. God has to do that. God has to make that bridge. God has to bridge that gap or resolve that tension. And how God does it is by taking on that sin upon God's self. So, the Son, which is part of the Trinity, the Son has to take on the sins of creation in order to resolve the tension between God the Father and creation. That's the idea of atonement. With a being from the foundation of the earth. Because if God knows, then how come God is grieving? Right? Becomes the existent question. It also becomes a question of why does Jesus cry out on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? If Jesus knows that he's going to rise again, then why does he ask that question? And the answer is that in order for God to make that connection with us, God has to enter into the pathos that we experience. And in order for that to be real, God has to, in a way, forget that God is God and experience it with us. Right? Does that make sense? Which seems for us to be a cognitive dissonance, because we go, and how can God really do that? Because still God must have in the back of God's mind, hey, I'm still God. But what that says about God is that that is a fullness of the nature of God's grace. That God can so fully enter our lives that God can feel the pathos that we feel. Even though God is God, and as God, God can be above that. Yes, God can be above it. God chooses not to be. Is everybody following me with this? Okay. This is what makes theology both fun and challenging. Because you're wrestling with these questions. And we don't know fully. And that's where, skip to the systematic part. Slide. This is what's called epistemology, or how this is the work of theology that figures out how do we know what we know, and how is that communicated to us. That's the work of epistemology. So God doesn't just come down in a voice of thunder and say, I love you and I forgive you. Right? What God does is God enters our reality in the form of Jesus Christ, a human being that is complete with all our frailties, and who dies for our behalf. And we're seeing, actually, to get back to the passage that we just read, we're seeing the first step towards that with Noah building an altar and start offering sacrifices. Because the sacrifice itself is a way of connecting creation with God, of being able to cleanse creation in a way. And that sacrifice lasts throughout most of Israel's history until Jesus becomes the last, the ultimate, the final sacrifice. This is the most problematic for some people of Christian theology, is the whole idea of sacrifice. Because it's difficult for many people to love a God who demands a sacrifice in order to be satisfied. But that's misreading the purpose of the sacrifice. The purpose of the sacrifice is not to please God, but to heal the human beings. the sacrifice isn't there to make God happy, but to somehow assuage the wound that exists in us. So Jesus doesn't die to please God. Jesus dies so that we may no longer have to fear death. So back to, what is this slide? Slide 6. Okay, what change has the flood effected in God? Well, the pathos existed before the flood, right? God was grieving. So what has changed after that? No, he doesn't see that humankind has changed. Right. But God kind of redoubles God's intention for us. God takes on our role. That's what changes God. God no longer has given up. God now is even more intentional. Because God remembers after the flood Noah. God remembers that even amongst all the evil, one man. What is the character of God's renewed commitment to creation? That God isn't going to be defeated by man's evil anymore. That God isn't going to react in such a dramatic way. How does the narrative view the human heart? The narrative views the human heart very severely. Are human beings dependent on the gift of grace which cannot be given to ourselves or to others? Yes, we are. Without grace, we have no hope. Without the grace of God, we have no hope. So, and I'm going to skip over the other slides because we're running late. So, the final image we have, and I'm going to encourage you to read the intervening passage, the turning point, because the turning point is for this passage, how we get from the beginning to the ending, is that the turning point is that God remembers Noah. God sees Noah in the boat. God sees the suffering of Noah. Because while it isn't mentioned, we can imagine what Noah's going through here. Noah's doing what God's asking. Noah's being obedient. But that's not without pain. Right? That's not without fear. So the turning point is that God sees in Noah, and God remembers what God intended in the first place. God remembers us, and God doesn't abandon us. So, the final sign of God's covenant is what? The rainbow. What is a bow? What? Well, except for in normal practices, what does a bow do? Shoots arrows. It's what? A weapon, right? Except for this bow, what does it lack? Not just the arrow is a separate thing. It lacks a string. And that string is not drawn back, is it? Because there is no string. So what is this weapon? It's no longer a weapon. And so God is putting in the sky a symbol that I will no longer use my wrath or my power as a weapon to hurt you. That's my covenant. I will not act in anger in order to destroy the earth. I have the power to destroy you, and I will put in the sky as a permanent symbol that I choose not to. That's the value of the rainbow. Something I had never thought of before I read this. But it's a powerful symbol. The rainbow in the sky is God's weapon unarmed forever. That's how much God loves us. I had a whole bunch of other stuff, but we gone long. So, any questions? Okay. No questions are goofy. Kind of have to be, don't we? Of course, it has to be symbolic in a way, because no. But if there's only 3 sons and 3 daughter-in-laws, human genetics says that there probably would be some inbreeding along the way. But what science also teaches us, tells us, is that the DNA of humankind, of all humankind, is only 1/10 of 1/10 of 1% difference. Of all humankind, all the people on the earth, the DNA is like 99.99998% the same. And what do we spend most of human history doing? Focusing on that very minuscule difference. Yeah, geneticists will tell you that the human race, the humankind, is almost identical in its DNA. All of the human race. So that gives testimony to the, yeah, we're all descendants of Noah. All men are brothers, all women are sisters, all of us are siblings in the human race. Okay.